So I think we're getting people in. How come we don't see them, or am I just not seeing them? Yo veo, I see the numbers going up, but I don't see the people.
So, are you still under panelists? You might, I don't know if you can click on total participants, but attendees, if you click on attendees, that's where they come up.
Ahora sí veo. Adriana, Angeles, okay. Barbara, Klaus on, Damon, Ellie's on, Guadalupe, Heike, Israel's on, Joshua, Ken, Kevin, Kyra. A woman named Kyra Ostendorf is on, David. Be careful. She has your same last name, so that can be good, that can be really bad. Luis Narvaez, Mary Hunniger, Miguel, Nancy, okay. Vincent Thomas, he's in the Quad Cities. That's cool. Okay. Okay, so I hope people can hear me. So how do we know if they can hear me? We just assume? Sí, ¿verdad?
Adriana said that she can hear you. So
cool. Thank you, Adriana. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'm not going to do an official welcome yet. I'm simply going to say that you're on the right webinar if you are looking for the teach-in on white supremacy, organized hate in the U.S. My name is Leone Jose Bicchieri. I'm the Executive Director of Working Family Solidarity. And what we're going to do first is we're going to go to our interpreters from Somos Sur. We are the South. Okay, and with us to interpret Spanish, English, Spanish are Eva Cárdenas and Cecilia Sáenz Becerra. And they're going to talk with you all first in English and Spanish to set you up with the interpretation technology. And then I'll start doing the official welcome. So thank you very much. And please, Somos Sur, go ahead.
Thank you all. Can you see my screen? Oh, it's not the right one. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Oh, there it goes. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon. The organizers of today's events have made a commitment to language justice. Los organizadores de este evento han hecho un compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. Este webinar o esta presentación va a ser en español e inglés. This webinar will be in Spanish and English. En un momento vamos a aprender el modo de interpretación, pero antes de eso queríamos hablar sobre unas prácticas que nos van a ayudar a crear este espacio. In a moment, we'll turn on the interpretation feature, but before that, we just wanted to go over a few things that will help make this space language justice accessible. Durante el evento, les estamos pidiendo a los panelistas y las personas que vayan a hablar que hablen en un tono despacio. So during the event, we're going to ask for both the panelists and the participants to please speak at a moderate, slow pace. Esto permitirá al intérprete que pueda decir todo lo que estamos interpretando. This will allow the interpreter to go ahead and interpret everything. So, recordamos de hablar lentamente, tomar pausas durante nuestras oraciones y tratar de mantener en cuenta que esto ayuda a todos, no solamente a los intérpretes. So, again, just to remind folks to please speak at a moderate pace, to take a breath after each sentence, and that this slowing down helps everyone, not just the interpreters. Si usted habla en una voz muy bajita, le pedimos que hable en voz alta y claro, especialmente si está ocupando micrófono, que no se lo ponga muy cerca ni muy lejos. If you are a person that speaks softly, we're asking you to please speak up a little bit louder and clear, especially if you're using headphones, to be mindful of the placement, whether that's way too close or too far. Les pedimos que una persona hable a la vez y esto ayudará a que el intérprete no tenga que elegir a quién interpretar. We're also asking that one person speak at a time. This allows us and the interpreters not to have to decide who we're going to prioritize when we're interpreting. Por último, les queremos recordar que el lenguaje no es una barrera. Al contrario, esto nos ayuda a extender las visiones y el trabajo que estamos haciendo. And lastly, we want to remind you that language is not a barrier, but rather it helps us to expand our understanding in ways in which we organize and work together. En un momento vamos a aprender el servicio de interpretación. In a moment, we'll turn on the interpretation feature. Cuando se prenda, si usted está ocupando su computadora, va a haber un globo o un icono de globo donde va a hacer clic y ahí puede seleccionar el idioma que usted prefiere. So once the feature is turned on, you will see a little glove icon at the bottom of your screen if you're using your computer. You need to click on that and then select the language in which you are most comfortable in. Si usted está usando su teléfono, este icono va a aparecer como 3 puntos, donde ahí tiene que seleccionar la interpretación y después seleccionar el idioma. If you're using your phone, you'll see 3-dot icon, and that icon will give you the interpretation feature, and then you can select the language once you click that. Muchas gracias. And podemos prender el servicio de interpretación. Thank you so much, and we can now turn on the interpretation.
So is that okay? We're ready to go with the interpretation. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead. I just want to make sure that my turning it on worked and everything's fine. So I'm going to move forward. Thank you so much. I'll do a brief welcome. Reverend Ostendorf will speak for a bit. Abraham Mwaura will speak for a bit. And then we'll make sure we have plenty of time for questions and comments. So again, my name is Leone Jose Bicchieri. I'm the Executive Director of Working Family Solidarity. And we have been hosting a series of racial unity dialogues and racial justice teach-ins. The teach-ins have a little more presentation. The racial unity dialogues have less presentation and more of a dialogue. But in both events, we promote questions, comments, and we also remind people that we're really scratching the surface of the various themes that we touch on. So this evening, we're talking about white supremacy in the United States, organized hate in the US. And we're not saying that, boy, after 90 minutes, you're going to understand everything about it. Of course, we can't. Our organization, Working Family Solidarity, believes that the United States, among other countries, was founded upon the disempowerment of people of color. And so we believe in our organization that unless we deal with undoing that foundation as we struggle together as working people, we can't really advance, even in the struggle for worker justice. So at Working Family Solidarity, we believe that the fight against racism is a moral imperative, but it's also a strategic imperative because we cannot have worker justice, ironically, even for white workers, until racism is destroyed. And so we think those things like a DNA strand actually go together. So our organization is committed to building that worker power for low and moderate income families, which describes probably everyone on this call, unless you're independently wealthy. You wake up in the morning and you sell your labor to someone else. It could be intellectual labor, physical labor. And so we want to unite people around those issues, come to see that someone is sort of causing us to fight against each other and not against the wealthy elite. So that's what our organization's about in a nutshell. I'm not going to say more about it for now so that we can get to our presenter and then our co-presenter. So we're going to talk, and I will also say now, in case some people can't stay the whole time, that on Saturday, March 20th at 10 a.m. Central Time, and we will send out notices to all of you. We have your emails. So that will be on a Saturday, March 20th. And we have a working group that's loose title is US, Europe, working group against racism and worker exploitation. And so Abraham Mwaura, one of our co-presenters, is joining us from Geneva, Switzerland, up very early in the morning, late at night. And so we appreciate it. And Abraham and other really great people are going to be, I'm going to facilitate, but other people from Europe, from Geneva, Paris, and Rome are going to present on what they see unfolding in Europe, the way that works in Europe to oppress workers and oppress people of color. We're going to get back to what we're doing today. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to start with a very good friend of mine, great colleague, great comrade, one of the people I trust most in this world, Reverend David Ostendorf. And he's going to talk for a little bit about his experiences over many years organizing in rural areas of the heartland, organizing farm families for justice, and also then moving into how he started organizing more specifically against organized hate groups and white supremacist groups, followed by Abraham, and I'll do that. We're going to hold questions and comments until after our second commentary by Abraham Mwaura. So first, we're going to start with my good friend, and thank you for being with us, David, Reverend David Ostendorf.
Thanks, Leonie. It's a real gift to be with all of you this evening. I really want to thank Leonie and all your leadership. It's good to be with Abraham and our other colleagues. And I want to lift up the amazing work of Working Family Solidarity. For those of you who are not out of Chicago or may not be familiar with the organization, I really would encourage you to visit the website. It's a groundbreaking and important effort to build solidarity among working families of color in the Chicago area, and its impact is growing across the country. So thank you. It's good to be with you. Leonie asked me to talk a little bit about why this white kid from Southern Illinois got involved in countering organized hate groups. I grew up across the river from St. Louis in a working class union labor family, and went on to school and became a minister in the United Church of Christ. I still am, of course, and have since 1974 been working and organizing across many areas of the country. I started, Abraham and I were kind of, we both started some of our organizing work in the coal fields. I in Southern Illinois in the coal fields for about 5 years. And then in 1981, I went to Iowa, the state of Iowa, which of course is predominantly white, particularly at that time, although it's certainly much more, it's a little rounded out with, of course, with all the immigrant labor in the state too. But I started there in 1981, just at the beginning of what was to become the worst economic crisis in rural America in decades, probably not since the 1930s. And it kind of snuck up on everybody. The challenge was that the federal government began to really put the squeeze on farm families and working families. And within a couple of years, it was very clear that more and more family farmers were losing their land and their farms. It was very clear that workers were being deeply affected, especially the workers in farm implement factories in Iowa, United Auto Workers, and other union members. And so we began working with farm families and with workers, with rural residents, with churches, anybody we could find, to get them together to begin to address and to organize the situation out there, organize to counter the situation. And so by 1984, we had county level committees pretty much across much of the state. And at the same time, we were working with our colleagues in other states who were organizing farm and rural and ranch families too. And we were working also with our Black farm brothers and sisters out of the South, because of course, Black farmers in this country have had generations of racial oppression on the land. And so it was obvious that we had to really, you know, establish working relationships with them, support one another, and so on. So we were really getting well underway by 1984. And I share all this with you because it's a little bit of an introduction to what happened then. We began hearing from some of our farm leaders that there were meetings going around the state with people coming in and telling them that the Jews were behind this whole farm crisis and that they were responsible for what was happening, this entire economic collapse. And we were just kind of astounded. And we started listening and tracking what was going on, who these people were, and so on. And to put it, a long story a little bit shorter, it was clear that racist and anti-Semitic forces from around the country were trying to move into the heartland to take advantage of farm and rural families and workers during this crisis. And we made a decision in our organization at Prairie Fire to take them on at the same time we were doing all of our other organizing works for a very clear reason. One, as Leonie mentioned earlier, it was a moral issue. These people were out preaching hate and racism and anti-Semitism. And then it wasn't long before people with the guns started coming in. This is in the mid-'80s, my friends. There were survivalist camps starting out in Missouri. There were shootings and killings in Nebraska and Missouri and other places, especially of law enforcement officers who were gunned down out of by farmers who, you know, were buying all of this rhetoric. And it was clear that something had to be done. And so we started organizing against this movement. And for the balance of that decade, we continued both of our organizing with farm rural worker people, et cetera, and our national organizing. And concurrently, at the same time, we organized to stop this movement. And we had some, I hesitate to use the word success, but we had some success pushing them back. And by the end of the decade, that happened. But then, of course, what happened after that was during the early 1990s, this hatred did not go away. And in 1995, everyone will remember Oklahoma City, where Timothy McVeigh, who had bought this hatred, lock, stock, and barrel, blew up the federal building and killed 168 men, women, and little children in that bombing. 168 were killed in that bombing. That was a direct outcome of this hate that had been festering. And about the same time, the militia movement started building across the region and so on. And that whole effort began to spread into the new century. And then it hooked up with the anti-immigrant movement, so that much of the hatred and the violence against immigrants was directly coming out of this movement, and the hatred it really pushed forward. And so we see that today, of course. We saw it on January 6th. We see it everywhere today. This movement has just deepened itself in many ways, where back in a few years back, there were more, a smaller handful of organizations to take on directly. This movement has spread through social media and other forms of communication and organizing themselves to what we have to face today. So it's a reality out there that never goes away. In this country, of course, given so much of the racial foundation of this country, it's going to be very difficult, a very big challenge to continue taking it on, but we have to take it on. And so I want to talk just a few minutes yet about kind of how to do that. Why do people get involved in this movement? Why do white people get involved in this movement? You know, some years back, we were able to work with a man named Floyd Cochran. Floyd Cochran was like second or third in command of the Aryan Nation. This was an extreme, violent, white supremacist organization based out of Idaho with influence around the country. And Floyd came out of that organization, and many of us were able to work with him. And in fact, we had him in Chicago to really help us work with youth in high schools who were being recruited to this movement. And Floyd always told the story about his growing up and not having any kind of, you know, place to go, anybody to turn to during his own struggles, until a white racist recruiter came along and drew him in. And his story was really powerful and reminded us that it's critical for us to make sure we're working to stop that kind of recruitment among youth, among older people as well. The challenge is always that, and especially today, people have so many sources of information out there. It's overwhelming. All of us do have so many, we have so many points of information coming at us all the time. And the question is, how do you choose what's right? I mean, most of us know how to do that, but for a lot of people, they're not sure. And I've said, Leone's heard me say many times, that I think one of the key roles of an organizer is to help people name the names. What is the name of this kind of force that's coming at us? Is it a racist organization, a racist recruiter? Is it racism? Whatever. We've got to help people name the names. You know, it happens very easily for powers that be to be able to play all of us off against each other. And Chicago has a rich history of that, dating back to the packing houses. You know, back in the early 20th century, late 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, the packing houses that were so dominant in Chicago, they perfected this system of setting people against one another. So they set the predominantly white Eastern European immigrants against each other, and then they set Black workers against the immigrants and vice versa. And they were able to keep everything in turmoil in the packing places so people couldn't organize. And guess what? They still do that. Leone and I worked in some packing houses community for quite a number of years recently, and they still put different workers on the line who speak different languages and can't communicate. If they can't communicate, they can't organize. It's very difficult. So we have to be able to help people understand, you know, what the real challenge is, what the problems are, and so on. We have to also really be able to fill in the vacuum of misunderstanding that's out there. If people have no sense of what's really happening and who's making it happen and what the names are, it's critical that as leaders and organizers, we help them understand that. I told Leone, I shared a story, he's heard it a few times. Some years back, I was working with a young farmer. I was at his kitchen table where so much organizing takes place, right? At his kitchen table, and he ran down a whole list of issues and concerns and problems with corporate America, problems with financial America, with the government, and so on. And I could have signed his bottom line. And he slapped the table and he said, yeah, you know what? That's communism for you. And I kind of sat there and looked at him and I said, well, Gary, I said, that's really not what communism is. That's more the kind of economic capitalist system we live in, and the government, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, so, you know, he was living kind of in this vacuum, and he didn't have, at that point, not that he was ignorant, and I'm not saying that, he just didn't have the right words, if you will. And it's my responsibility to help shape his understanding so that he could become the kind of leader he was. And he was an important leader for us in our work. But that kind of effort is so important. I think there are basically, regardless of what period we're in, there are three basic strategies that I continue to use in countering racist organizations and racist organizing. One, we have to expose who these people are and who the organizations are. We have to name them. Secondly, we have to inform our members and our leaders and other people in our communities and neighborhoods. We have to inform them of who those forces are, those organizations, those leaders. If there's a Chicago police officer who's running around with Oath Keepers badges on or something, we need to know who Oath Keepers is. We need to inform other people about who Oath Keepers might be, because this movement has infiltrated law enforcement. We know that. The thing after exposing and informing is obviously we got to educate to counter these organizations in this movement. It's critical that we do the organizing, and it's hard to do that when we got so many other concerns on our plates. Our families, our homes, our jobs, paying the rent and mortgage, whatever it might be, putting food on the table. But if we don't take that level of kind of racial organizing seriously, it just continues to build, and it will come back and really bite us some way, one way or another. So I think that might kind of wrap up what I wanted to, the main points I wanted to share with you this evening, and I hope that answers some of the questions Leone asked me to address. Just to say, again, getting back to his original question, why am I involved in this? I'm involved because it's a fundamental moral issue. For me, it's a faith issue, but it's also an issue that, white people have to take responsibility for countering racism. It's the responsibility of white people to counter racism. And it's not to say it's not everybody's responsibility, but, it's white folk can be good allies with organizations of color, that's fine, but white people also have to work in their own places and communities with white people to make sure that we can turn the tide of this. And it's a constant struggle. It's a constant and never-ending struggle. I was reading again today about John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, who were both major figures in the civil rights movement, along with so many others. But they never gave up. They never stepped back in this effort. And thousands and tens of thousands of folk are out there doing this work across the country, across the globe, as Abraham will tell us too, who are, in one, making one step, one movement forward to build the kind of just world that all of us seek, where everybody has something of a decent shot at living a decent life. So I think that I'll wrap that up here, Leone. Let Abraham take over, and then we'll move on from there. So I hope that's okay.
That's great. And I want to segue again. I just put this in the chat, but I see we already have some questions and comments, which is terrific. Again, instead of answering those now, and then again, sometime there may be no ultimate answer to really, really good questions, sort of how do we stop this? Could be a long discussion, but those are, I'm already seeing terrific comments and information and questions, and we'll get to, if we can, all of them, and if not, we will do as many as we can very soon. I didn't want to open up to questions and comments yet, but I want to segue into Abraham Mwaura, also a friend of mine going way back, whom I mentioned earlier, now lives in Geneva, Switzerland. So he's joining us at a very difficult hour for him, and we're very grateful. I want to thank Reverend Ostendorf. I want to thank David for his words. And I want to echo what David was saying. We felt that it's very important for everyone to fight against racism. But I really wanted this friend of mine whom I have seen living out the things he's talking about, and to not just talk about which groups are which groups and so on. You can go on Google and look at Proud Boys and, Posse Comitatus and, and so on. You can find those. But I also wanted David to share a little bit about, how these people are recruited, folks who are fighting for their rights in their minds. They're fighting for their family farms, their rights, and so on, and how easily that slips into this fight against these imaginary foes, sort of, holding Black, Latino, and others as responsible for their woes, when it's usually the rich white agribusiness owners who are taking their farms. So I wanted to remind ourselves of some of that recruiting ground. And then Reverend Ostendorf was ending about talking about some of those groups and kind of the white supremacist organized movement and their recruiting. So now we're going to shift into Abraham Mwaura, who's going to talk a little bit more. He's going to comment on some things he heard Reverend Ostendorf say and end with 1 or 2 questions for David, to then open it after that into more and more questions from all of you, spoken, or we'll pull them off the chat, okay? And after Abraham speaks, we will open up also the video section so that Asia, our chat moderator, Asia Anderson, can then pull you in and unmute you so that you can ask a question and so on, or have a comment. So I'm very proud to have a great friend, colleague, comrade, Abraham Mwaura, with us to add on to what David was saying and also finish with a question or 2 for David. Thanks very much for staying up at an ungodly hour to join us from Geneva. Thank you. Please go ahead, Abraham.
Thank you, Leone. I've said to you many times in the last few weeks how much I appreciate your making space, both personally, but also now in this kind of like amazing forum to, allow us to air some of these really critical issues. I wanted to say, I'm not going to make much of a commentary, but I did kind of want to follow suit from Dave and at least give some background of why I ended up, even being a respondent to his presentation, and then maybe make some responses. A few years, so I moved to Geneva now about three and a half years ago. And soon after I moved here, there was like a lot of attention in the mainstream media paid to what seemed like a kind of uptick in human trafficking from Africa. It followed it had followed, but kind of we didn't know about it. It seemed the Arab Spring uprisings or revolutions, and in particular, there was one thing that really concerned me, and it was that there are now auction blocks again. And they're operating in Libya, which has become basically a ungovernable kind of place after France and the US and NATO just bombed the hell out of it and kind of left whatever, obviously Gaddafi had his problems, and I mean, that's not really what I want to bring up, but he had really made himself an enemy of the West in terms of his perspectives on how to unite Africa and Africans and Black people more broadly, and so they punished him and eventually executed him, and left behind this space for what seems to me to be a new slave trade. So, and again, a few years ago, you know, I really had a realization about this. I had been paying attention to white supremacist infiltration of the police and military, as you know, as Davis pointed out, that is kind of like a very dominant phenomenon in the U.S. I had paid attention to it. There had been FBI reports and other kinds of investigations of it, but this was really the first time that I had seen something so blatant that seemed to be taking us, like, not just backwards a few steps, but like really gross in a way that, I mean, yeah, that there were regular auctions of Black bodies in Libya. It's not clear to me where these folks are being taken to, what kind of work they're doing, but it's a modernization of something that's that, you know, started in the 1400s and 1500s, and has kind of you know, the logistics of it has been modernized to the point where now actually you can use apps to trade slaves and so on and so forth. And so I began to talk, being in Geneva, I thought, well, this is kind of an obvious place to address this. If there's any place in the world, and actually I specifically thought to myself, I mean, they're the most elite Black people in Geneva of anywhere in the world. Surely we can do something about this. And there were some marches. There was one march in Geneva, a march that turned violent in Paris. There was a very well-organized march in Zurich, which is also in Switzerland. But that was it, right? It was like a week or two of an outcry, and then nothing else. And it burned me in some ways, that I would have conversation after conversation, kind of, you know, trying to figure out, well, how do we take the movement against you know, human trafficking to the next level, try to really create a 21st century abolitionist movement, you know, for something that seemed so grotesque and that people should really be responding to, and nobody really took it up. The human rights folks, to, you know, to the UN folks, and it just never kept people's attention. And then, of course, in the last few years, it's become clearer and clearer that, again, so back to this point about the police being infiltrated, that a lot of the violence being perpetrated by police on Black folks in the US and in other parts of the world had this same white supremacy at its root. It was giving white supremacists you know, a way to both disenfranchise Black people by criminalizing them, but also to exercise their own, you know, their own drive to, you know, to perpetuate violence against Black people. And so I, again, tried to reach out to people in Geneva, hoping that maybe we could get the international community to even make a statement against the U.S., you know, U.S. policing. And again, it never really, I've not, or up until this point, I still have not really been able to gain much traction. So I reached out to Leone. Long story short as well, I reached out to Leone. This was now a few months ago. It was right before January 6th. That was basically at the, you know, like felt like it was my last straw. I was going to, you know, somehow, you know, go back to my, or, you know, at least part of my organizing roots in Chicago and find someone who I knew was like-minded and figure out some strategies on how we could together address this. So that's why I'm here. And yeah, I'm very grateful that you've asked me to be a respondent on this session. I cheated to some degree, and I gave Dave some questions beforehand, but then now listening to your presentation, I have a couple more. I gave you a couple first, and then now I have a couple more points that I picked up on, but I will start with the ones that I had already given you before. As I had mentioned to Dave, I was really struck by this testimony from Frank Mink to the US Congress. I think it was just last year. And I want to read you, he's a former white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former KKK member, and who's basically figured out how to, change himself from inside out, and has become a Black Lives Matter activist. I don't know how much you can trust that, but indeed his words are very sincere. So I wanted to read you just a few paragraphs to again set the framework for my first question. Frank Mink. At the age of 13, I was kicked out of my mom's home and made to move in with my dad, who lived in a mixed and very rough neighborhood in Southwest Philadelphia. I was the new kid, a skinny punk rock white boy in an all-black middle school. This is where the fear turned to hate. That summer, I went up to visit my cousin in Lancaster County. This is Pennsylvania. This is Amish County. Although my family was not Amish, and I promise you, there are no Amish neo-Nazis. I thought my cousin and his friends were so cool. They were older and they were neo-Nazis. I would hear them make racist comments, even though they'd never spent any time with Black people. When they heard where I went to school, I became the urban inner city expert. I began to feel like I mattered. The day I decided to join the movement was the day I saw other people fear my new group of friends. I saw them as powerful. Up until that point, I might have been a teenager, but in reality, I was a 7-year-old scared little boy who feared everything. I feared my parents, my step-parents, my school, and I feared I wasn't going to have enough food to eat. I wanted people to fear me. So I became a member of the neo-Nazi movement. I got a swastika tattooed on my neck to prove my undying loyalty. I joined this movement for survival, which made me grasp onto every word that was said in the room. And here's what I heard. And then he goes on to basically, in his testimony, talk about basically being recruited to join the police over and over and over in multiple neo-Nazi groups. Sorry, I'm going to turn the light back on just a second. So this is what I was struck by, was the anger. And in fact, what I said to Dave is, in some ways, I could relate to the anger. That I too, I'm mixed race, but in the US, I'm Black for all intents and purposes. I feel like the society doesn't accept me. I'm not supposed to be there. And it's created this kind of brooding anger inside of me, and it was particularly for me, I think, really striking to be able to relate to the roots of this, of Frank Mink's, neo-Nazism as this same kind of anger, looking to be respected in some way by a society that didn't, and that was rejecting him instead. I mean, this idea of him wanting people to fear him, I you know, I really tried to be like a ninja, and you know, I also want people to fear me. You know, I want cops to fear me. Um, I've had many conversations with other, I mean, when I was younger than I am now, but I mean, with other young Black men who really question how they would react in, you know, in such and such situation with the police, right? And it's all rooted in anger, right? Like basically this sense about how fiercely we would fight if we were confronted with, you know, one of now hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of racist cops, it seems. Anyway, I found it interesting about this anger, and I mean, so my first question is really about how to undo that, both in myself, but also, I mean, it's a strange reality to be able to relate to this neo-Nazi in terms of where he's coming from. So the other piece was is related, is kind of on the flip side of that coin, and it's about forgiveness. And I mean, like as I said before, I mean, the roots of this go hundreds of years back, and it's about slavery and disenfranchisement and colonialism, you know, at least on the African continent, but other places as well, Asia and Latin America. And I wonder where the space is to actually undo this, undo the roots of this. And my specific question is whether the US has missed its chance for a truth and reconciliation process. So, you know, obviously it's always been flawed where it's been tried in South Africa, in Rwanda, in Czechoslovakia, so on and so forth. But is it too late for the US to even attempt to have some kind of truth and reconciliation process? And then your talk today, I added two more questions. The one thing that you touched on, and obviously is kind of like a thread that goes through a lot of your experience, is about the land, which, I mean, from our conversation the other day, I you know, I don't know, it wasn't as obvious. And I'm struck by that in particular because of the, obviously with slavery and colonialism, there's also this element of the land being this critical factor in people's disenfranchisement, and it's partially even a disenfranchisement from the land itself, right? And so you're talking about white rural farmers, you know, losing their farms, and of course there's, you know, urban people of color losing their homes. But if you go back far enough, it's all about this loss of the land, right? Like somehow the system has ripped people away from their homeland. And then, I mean, in some ways, Africa was really set up by slavery to then have the land ripped away from the people. And anyway, I thought that was an interesting, that's an interesting thread, and I would like to hear if you have some reflections on this piece about the land. I also wanted to point out that, you know, there were, you know, in the process of enslaving Africans, there was constant resistance to enslavement. I mean, at every phase, right? So all the way back in their villages, they were fighting, right? And then at the coast, there were slave revolts, and then on the ships, there were slave revolts, and then when they got to the Western Hemisphere, there were slave revolts. And what ended up happening is the creation of these maroon communities who were multicultural, had many languages, you know, who had to figure out how to organize themselves. independent of the slave masters. And very often there were white maroons who were allied with the former slaves, right? These tended to be poor, white, what's the right word, but, you know, basically indentured servants who would otherwise have been farmers, but ended up with the white maroons. In Spanish, it's the marrones, and in Brazil, it's the quilombos, right? And it's this rich history of Black people constantly resisting slavery and finding themselves independent with only the land to, you know, for their sustenance. But in almost every case, there's this almost yin-yang element where there are white people who have marooned themselves with those Black people. And then the last point, again, that you touched on, and I'll be very curious about your perspectives, is about the unions. And it was very interesting to hear you say that the white farmers are, were union members as well, and or at least had unions were in the community, were also organizing there. Because I guess I might as well be blunt. I mean, I feel like the unions have let us down in particular with police violence. I mean, it's Leone and I've had, this ongoing conversation of it. I mean, his perspective is also very clear, right? Like, this is about workers across the races, and racism being used to leverage one group of workers against the other. And then here are the unions playing, I'm again being maybe too blunt and too sharp or whatever, playing right into it, right? I mean, why aren't the unions taking a stand against this? Why aren't the unions throwing the police out of the AFL-CIO and not referring to them as brothers and sisters in the labor movement? I mean, it should be really clear to the workers' movement that they're functionaries of oppression, not again, quote, brothers and sisters. So those were my two original questions about anger and truth and reconciliation, and then I'm very curious about the land and the unions.
Well, let me try to answer that.
Let me just jump in. Let me jump in for half a second. So,
okay.
No, that's good. My role is a little bit timekeeper as well. So we're at 5 minutes to 7 Central U.S. time. We're doing fine. But what we've left Reverend Ostendorf with Dave is those 5 question comments, and you have about 5 minutes to do what you can with that, maybe slightly more, only because I just want to make sure, although this is a teach-in, as opposed to a racial unity dialogue where it's almost all dialogue. So 5, if you want to take a little more than that, that's fine too, Dave. But
yeah.
We won't go back to Abraham after this. You answer whatever you want to answer. And then after this, for those of you who are waiting, I see some questions, I see some comments, and we will then be getting those to David. Abraham might want to tackle 1 or 2. I might add a quick little comment as far as Working Family Solidarity's view. But David, please, what's your response to that? And then after that, we'll go ahead and open it up to more questions and comments.
You say 5 minutes or 5 hours? Okay.
Yeah, well, do what you can, and it could go a little more than 5 minutes, but a little bit longer.
I want to do it quickly, because I really do want to have questions and conversations with our friends on the call. Just run down a couple of things in terms of anger. Yes, I think the question for me is, how do you direct anger, and how do you take that level of anger and help people understand where it ought to be directed, instead of my anger is going to go and I'm going to join the a neo-Nazi group, as opposed to I'm going to join in with my communities of color to fight similar kinds of efforts. One of my close organizer friends out in California, he always says, and I agree with him, but there's some limit to it, said you cannot be a good organizer unless you're angry. And I think he's right. anger drives me a lot. And I've tried to, really live with it in some different ways. And that goes to sort of, the question about power, a question about forgiveness, if you will. I think, for me, there's forgiveness and accountability are two sides of the same coin. You might forgive somebody, but they also are accountable for what they've done, okay? And, that's a whole different thing that each of us have to wrestle with ourselves in terms of our own morals and faith and everything else. But I don't think, you can't separate the two of them from me. Thirdly, the land, absolutely, the land is central to some, to historic struggles. I mean, there's a keen and painful awareness that all the white farmers we were working with over the years, they had taken native land, right? I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, and, I mean, there are, native nations up here, thank goodness, constantly remind us that this was their land, and it's so much of it still is their land. And, whites are still trying to take it away in every way they possibly can. So the same goes with the struggle of Black farmers in the South. The land was at the center of so much of the oppression of Black families in the South. And then at the same time, it was also so much of the critical base of the civil rights movement, having the land base among so many people. So no question about that. And I happened to be in Brazil some years back, as you say too, communities of color and whites working together in the Santera movement in Brazil back in those days, and still are. And so again, how do we build? How do we build? And then finally, the unions questions. I mean, yeah, the union, the story of racism within organized labor in this country is so painful and so crucial to what unions became, what they did, what they're doing now. Good things they're doing, but I agree with you that this whole situation with law enforcement unions is, you wanna perk my level of anger up, then we'll start talking about police unions. And I don't want to get into it, but boy, I tell you, I fully concur that, that whole effort has taken some very, very unfortunate and deadly directions. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, so here's where we'll go. I wanted to add really quickly, just as a point of privilege, since I get to act like I'm the facilitator and then sneak in my own quick little comments. But I have a long background in union, worker center, and farm worker union, and community organizing and labor. And I think that this is a comment that this is something I think we want to come back to. But as many of you remember, in the 1950s, right, McCarthyism was designed to take out elements like us, if you will, from organized labor, and to make sure that people that had an analysis of how all working people of all races needed to come together and include within that a very critical view and a fight against racism as a necessary part of the struggle for worker rights. In other words, people actually believed, like I do, that it's scientific as well as moral. You simply cannot have a successful worker movement if the worst off workers of color, are not actively promoted as equal and great leaders within our movement. It simply won't work. And so, of course, McCarthyism took out many of those elements in the 50s and left many union leaders, national union leaders, but it was a kind of a deal with the white supremacist Senate and Congress, if you will, and president, which was, you get to sit at the table and look important, and we'll let you have a National Labor Relations Act that came in the 30s, but we'll kind of give you a seat at the table and so forth in the Democratic Party. Sometime you can be a little bit Republican, but in return, you serve up these folks that you get to say are communists, whether they are or not. We'll get rid of them, but those tended to be the people like Abraham, like myself, like Reverend Ostendorf, like many of you on this call, many of you whom I know. And so there's been a fight to make sure that unions don't have those leaders that actually believe that racism must be destroyed, or we simply can't get anywhere as a worker struggle. We'll come back to that in the future. I wanted to look to Asia, our chat moderator, for a minute, for a little support and a little help as we go toward our first question comment. Again, if we don't take you in order, have a little understanding. We're going up and down the chat, and we will do our best to get to everyone's. But Asia, what should we do next here?
I think you said that we wanted to take a couple of comments and calls, so I'm just going to give everyone access as a panelist. That way, if you're comfortable with turning your camera on, you can. You'll also have access to change the settings for your microphone. I think Nancy, I don't know if you had a comment that you wanted to add or a question.
No, I was just asked to unmute. That's all.
Nancy, why don't you go
Ask my
ahead with...
question? Did you
I
want
think-
me to ask my question?
I'm sorry. Yes, please. I saw your, and again, for other people, we'll do our best to get to you as soon as we can. I think you had a question for Reverend Ostendorf regarding congregations. Would you like
I did.
to ask that?
I would. David, what do you see as local congregations' role and responsibility in teaching about white supremacy and white privilege?
Well, interesting you should ask. We're dealing with that right now in the congregation that I'm serving in River Falls, Wisconsin. And some of my friends from the congregation are on this call, I believe. Several may be. We're in a community of about 15,000, predominantly white, and we made a commitment, especially after last summer, to really gear up our engagement in the cities after the killing of George Floyd, and to do that in a number of different ways. Obviously, there's sort of the education approach, but it's also just, drawing on our own history, drawing on new relationships being developed in the cities and so on, and particularly looking at how we deepen our direct engagement in the cities in neighborhoods of color. So that's the challenge that we have, and I think it's a challenge for most congregations, no matter where they are and no matter what their composition is. This has to be taken on, and it has to be taken on in much more than just the education approach, if you will. Well, let's just learn more about what's going on, as opposed to, yes, learning, but also doing. So I hope that answered it.
It does.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'll remind folks as we'll look to a little help from Asia for our next question or comment, but I'll remind you, this is such a giant topic, right? Oh, we're going to do 90 minutes on white supremacy. That'll do it. I'm not even sure that we can say it scratches the surface. So please have patience. We're trying to, one of the reasons I really wanted David to be with us is so it's not, again, just talking about, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers and stuff that we can all quickly open Twitter, but that we can also hear about how some of the subtle stuff happens in many of these rural communities, so that we can begin to think about that as we all struggle forward, hopefully after this call as well. But I believe that Thomas Benz had a question and a comment. So please go ahead, Thomas. I think you might be muted, Thomas.
I'm sorry. Okay. Thomas? I think Thomas had a question next.
I can see the name, Thomas Benz, if I'm saying it correctly, but I see you as muted. I also read your comment earlier. Should we try to dig it out of the written section here? If he said, oh boy, let's see if we can get to it. Oh, yeah, please go ahead,
Okay,
Thomas.
good. I just unmuted. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Now this goes back earlier to David's, very important comment on, I think you said stop. How do we stop the racist recruiting? And I think we're all aware, whether you mute an ex-president or not, that this is going around and it's going to spread, and there will be news sources. So my question is, I don't believe we can stop it. How is the question not how do we confront it and counter it, and who does it, and how do we do it? And I'm wrestling with this because it's got to be more than email and sending tweets around.
Well, yeah, I think, I was thinking as I got ready for this evening too, and some other things I've just been reading recently. It's just that, with social media, with the pandemic shutdown, and everything else, the opportunities for dialogue. I know that's a heavy word, and perhaps it looks like kind of a silly word in this context, but the opportunity to sit down and talk with people has been so diminished in this past year. And I look upon people, there's certain people, it's like, I don't really waste my time trying to talk with them because I know it's not going to make any difference. I have to sort of, weigh out who I might be able to have conversation with that would have a possibility of, at least opening up to some different kinds of conversation. So, for example, I had a mechanic in a rural area just a few years ago, and he and I developed this amazing relationship. And he was totally on the other side of the political spectrum. I'm not sure he was. I would say he's, racist and all that. But I hesitated to take my car to him half the time because he wanted to talk. He wanted to have a conversation with me. And, I really liked the guy. We had great conversation. He said to me one day, he said, I really appreciate our conversation because you had so many different experiences than I've had. And, my response was, you've had so many different experiences than I've had. And so, sometimes there's that opportunity to bridge, sort of the differences, if you will. But again, I'm not saying that's going to work with everybody by any stretch of the imagination. And you have to be able to discern kind of like, this is total waste of time. Or, here's how we build relationships. But, if we're not about building relationships, then we're not going to get anything accomplished. We've got to build relationships with people, even people we may not particularly like or agree with.
We'll transition. Again, I'm going to sneak in I lived in Chicago now many years, but I organized in rural areas for many years, various parts in the States. And I want to echo part of that relationship building. And Thomas, I also don't assume that you don't have considerable experience yourself. So I view this as more like we're sharing different experiences to try to get to something better. But what I saw in the rural areas, I organized mainly people of color, but also white chicken farmers, hog farmers. And what I found a lot of the time was at first, they really hated me, although they didn't know me. It was like, that's Leone, the communist from Chicago. They knew nothing about me, and I'm not a member of the Communist Party. But it was like, yeah, that's Leon. He's a communist from Chicago. And I was like, great, thank you very much. But I swear, there's something about just not going away. And they took visit after visit after visit after visit to Arkansas, Georgia, North Carolina, Kansas, Missouri. Sometimes where I had to move from motel to motel because people were trying to hurt me. And then it got to the point where some of the white chicken farmers, after a bunch of visits, were like, you know what? Don't stay at the motel anymore. Stay at my house. And I was like, you sure? He was like, yeah, I'll tie up the dog so he doesn't chew you to shreds. And I'd stay with these folks out in the middle of nowhere with their 300-foot chicken houses and get up at 4 a.m, help them look at the chickens. And I'm not going to lie, I don't want to be hokey. It's not like after a few months we saw everything eye to eye. We did not. We absolutely did not. They were very much, you know, U.S. military, respect the flag, this kind of thing. But they started to turn a little bit on the economic factors. So it's like, I don't know if I agree with you, Leon, about all these things, but okay, this idea of white chicken farmers, black chicken catchers, Latino plant processing workers coming together to make sure we all get a better price for our chicken, better price for our labor. Okay, I can, you know, that might work, because they were experiencing exploitation from other white people. They weren't allowed to drive their chickens, their broilers, 7-week grow outs, onto the scale at the plant. They had to get out of the truck, giant semi. Someone from the plant drove the semi onto the scales. Then they got off and they went, hey, Jared, you get 1 ton. And Jared goes, no, that's 2 tons. And he goes, oh, yeah, I say it's 1 ton. And if you want to sell chickens anywhere in this Tri-County area, you will take the 1 ton. So we started to have a breakthrough, but yet it also showed the danger where some of them clearly were sort of U.S. military. We have to do right. We have to show the world about democracy. They had this kind of ingrained, even as we made some inroads into economic solidarity. So one thing I want to throw out there is I think we also need to promote economic solidarity, so that not so we win people over, because I think that's hokey, but so that we can at least talk. We can at least have a place where we can talk about our differences, but they need to see someone is offering them this alternative, because all they see right now is Oath Keeper, right? Proud Boys, Posse Comitatus, and that's my way to have pride as a poor white person. And I think we need to show them that this may shock you, and it does shock poor white people, but I, as a Latino, am your natural ally. Abraham, as an African American, is your natural ally. And I think we have to find a way to at least talk about that. Anyway, I wanted to add that in the mix. Asia, if I'm correct, I think we're going next to Matthew Robbins, or to Matthew Robinson.
Yes.
Matthew, have at it.
Hey, I just had a question, and was hoping that Reverend Ostendorf could recap what he had said were the 3 things that he thinks were primary to fight white supremacist ideas from spreading. I was just wondering if you could recap those.
Yeah, there are basically 3 things. 1, expose who they are, expose who these organizations are. In other words, you know, call it out for what it is, name them. Secondly, inform other people, our neighbors, our co-leaders, our workers, and so on, about who they are. And thirdly, organize to counter what they're trying to do. So expose, inform, and organize. Those are the 3 things.
Thank
Can
you.
I answer your question, Matthew?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have any follow-up to that, Matthew? Are you good?
Oh, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I believe, and it's, I think I see Guadalupe Ramirez there. So Asia, are we going to Guadalupe next?
Yes, and Guadalupe, you have 2 different accounts, so I'm not sure if that was the right account or not.
¿Nos oyes, Guadalupe? Tienes que quitar mudar de tu micrófono.
Sí, buenas
¿Puedes?
noches.
Ahora sí. Ahora sí, échale ganas.
Sí, nada más quería comentar, pues sí, lamentablemente, pues, como dije en los comentarios, por más de que algunas personas luchemos por no ser racistas, por tratar de educar a nuestros hijos y explicarles que todos somos iguales, ¿verdad? Pues sí, lamentablemente sigue habiendo personas así que son racistas con los afroamericanos, con los latinos, con los de otros países. Entonces, pues seguiremos, mientras haya personas como ustedes, como nosotros, que tratamos de educar lo más posible a nuestros hijos, de hablarles de la igualdad. Sí se puede lleva tiempo, toma tiempo, pero pues no nos queda de otra. Es mi comentario nada más.
Okay. Now, David, are you on the English interpreting thing channel? Could
Oh,
you?
no, I'm sorry. I'm not. My
That's okay.
apologies.
That's okay. I got you. So here's my simplistic recap from what Guadalupe said. She had also written some of it in the chat in Spanish. So I'm not going to sum it up perfectly, but essentially one of the things Guadalupe was saying and writing was, and Guadalupe lives here in Chicago. She said that we need to try to get to a place where we're not racist, but a lot of that starts at home. A lot of that starts in our families. And it's a longer term struggle, I think, partly educational in our families, because even in our community, and I take that to mean the Mexican American, Latinx community, she said in our community in Spanish, we also, we often have racism in our own community as Latinx people, and we need to fight that at home. So I wanted to make that commentary that I think there's a part of this struggle that has to happen on a kind of a personal transformation and an education in our own families, and that's what I wanted to say. So I don't know if you want to have any comment on that.
Well, I appreciate that and certainly concur with it, because all of us have to do that in our individual lives and our family lives and so on. But the thing I would say is that, working with Working Family Solidarity may be one of the best things that will, grow that in Chicago, because the way that communities are reaching across to each other, and it's just an incredible, as I said earlier, it's a groundbreaking and important approach. And I'm so grateful, Guadalupe, for your comments and reflections. I think, if you're part of the organization, to continue in that role is going to be a big help to you, and maybe other leaders and members of the organization can continue to have that kind of conversation with one another.
Thank you, David. And I think I see that Claudia has hand up. Let me say two things very quickly before we go on. We're going to do all we can to end at 7:30 sharp. Have a little patience if we slide a couple minutes past that. I know some people cannot stay a lot longer. A couple people have left that had told me earlier they can get on. They couldn't quite stay the full 90 minutes, but we will officially end at 7:30 Central Time, maybe slightly after. We'll go with Clau. I do want to signal to Abraham that I will give you a few minutes to say whatever you want about kind of how this has all been going on and what you're thinking about this. Also, you can add some more minutes as well. You've stayed up until the wee hours. And for someone who has a 7-month-old baby, that's a huge sacrifice, because you guys know what I mean. When they sleep, you got to sleep. Poor Abraham. We appreciate it. And then I want to remind people, in case a couple more people leave in the next few minutes, I will follow up with information about March 20th, Saturday, March 20th, 10 a.m. Central Time. Abraham, Brigida from Abraham from Switzerland, Brigida from Paris, and Antonello from Rome are going to present, each one for a while, on intersections between racism and worker exploitation in Europe. Abraham's going to talk a little bit about the US. And so we want to form this sort of coalition of groups in Europe and the US that are actively fighting racism and worker exploitation, and in the way we do it, which is where we see that you can't advance on either one without the other. It's like, you get half here, racism, worker exploitation. Try to do this one, it doesn't work. Try to do this one, it doesn't work. When you put them together, the ball will roll. And so we'll be telling you more about that. So let's go forward with Claudia Galeno's comment or question.
Tengo un comentario. Nada más quisiera decir que yo como mexicana Y bueno, no solo yo, también hablo con otras personas que también son de color, mexicanas o afroamericanas, y quisiera comentar que vivimos con miedo, vivimos con incertidumbre, porque vimos lo que pasó en enero 6. El Capitolio fue atacado, hubo personas muertas, y aún así la persona que inició todo públicamente, siguió siendo presidente los últimos días, y posteriormente, no sé, no hubo ningún impeachment, no lo va a poder volver a poner su candidatura como presidente. Y no sé, es increíble ver cómo toda la violencia que ocurrió desde que él inició su campaña para presidente. Sus bases, todos sabemos que fueron violentas, fueron racistas, fueron llenas de odio. Ahora con lo de el coronavirus, está habiendo muchas personas asiáticas asesinadas, porque él también estuvo promoviendo que el Chinese virus. Entonces está habiendo muchos asesinatos en contra de asiáticos. Para mí como mexicana es súper, la verdad es que nos llena de miedo el hecho de ver que personas pueden usar la presidencia en este caso y promover el odio racial tan abiertamente. Puede haber asesinatos en el Capitolio, y las cosas siguen igual. Y es súper feo, Lo único que nos queda, pues, unirnos con personas blancas que estén en contra del odio racial, y con personas con comunidades de color para podernos defender. Eso era todo.
So David, you're giving me the extra interpreting work, but I'll give you the summing up, and thank you for the patience for those who are, who might listen to this again. But the basics of what Clau was saying was, I'm Mexican, and as a Mexican person in the United States, in Chicago, I saw what happened on January 6th. I saw that the main person who orchestrated whom I believe was the former president, nothing really happened to him. Nothing happened to the people that stormed the Capitol. Nothing seems to happen to a lot of these folks. So it's made me feel even more scared, just to be alive, just to walk around. I feel like people now think that former president, is now going to run again. What if he wins again? And I feel like, and I'm seeing and hearing about a lot of Asian people getting attacked. I believe it's because the former president used to say things like China virus instead of COVID-19. So I just feel really worried that sort of this bigger political national power is opening up space for kind of more open racism, and I'm really scared that that people of color like me will be hurt. And then finally, it feels like the only way forward, even if we didn't originally see that as poor people of color, is ironically probably to unite nationally with white people of good heart and good conscience that agree with us and believe that we shouldn't have to live in this kind of fear. And so that's what I wanted to say. And why don't you say something about that, David? We'll see if there's any other comment after that. If there is or isn't, then I want to give a few minutes to Abraham to close us out.
I really appreciate your openness in saying that, because it's a huge reality in this country right now, and it's going to be for some time, I'm afraid. There have been, I think, over 100 people from January 6th who have been detained, arrested, whatever it may be, but that won't stop what's happening, what is happening. I think you're right in terms of saying, how do we build own organizations in our neighborhoods, in our towns and cities? And yes, how do we ally with one another? across communities of color with white allies and so on. And, that is happening everywhere in this country. As far as I know, I had a long conversation this week with one of my friends here in the Twin Cities who's doing that kind of very work, particularly with immigrant workers in construction and in the rebuilding of the cities here after last summer. So I think there's a lot going on, and we need to continue to raise up these stories of hope and possibilities with one another, and really kind of affirm, those possibilities out there. So thank you for sharing that. And, I convey to you my heartfelt thanks for your openness and my encouragement, for what it's worth, for your continuing to work with working families and other organizations out there too, to make sure that we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And did we have anyone else, Asia? I mean, we can probably continue finding more things. We're gonna have to wrap this up pretty quickly. Was there one more before we go to Abraham?
Not that I know of.
Okay. So then, muy bien. So if something comes up that's urgent. So again, thanks for hanging in there. We may go slightly past 7:30. We will, if you have to get off, we do appreciate you being with us. We'll let you know about our next one on the 20th of March. But I do want to make sure, Abraham, and you don't have to keep it to a minute, Abraham. Take a few minutes. Just, I've known you for a long time. I know that you and I overlap a lot in our belief of worker struggle and fighting racism, and we're scratching the surface. We hope it was a good, deep scratch today, but we got a lot more work to do. But how are you feeling about this commentary? How is this moving you? What are you thinking about?
I don't have much of a kind of thoughtful response, but I'm very appreciative for your work, Leone, and for your presentation, Dave, and to the commenters from the group at large. I think I get better now what Working Family Solidarity is about, and that's really, I just wanted to say I'm very appreciative. I think at some point I said to you, Leone, it's more like the dialogues are actually about our dialogues by workers about race, and rather than just racial unity. This isn't just a kumbaya type exercise, and I really see like the potential here now, or I feel I agree with Dave. Basically, this is if we're looking for solutions to these really tough problems, this is an example of how this can be done. So again, I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
Yeah, and I encourage people, you got a little tidbit of Abraham and many of his experiences and insights and things he's working on. Again, he'll be one of the featured presenters with Brigida Proto, who was on here. Oh, she's still on here, joining us from Paris, France, also hardly sleeping tonight. A terrific person, and Antonello Mangano as well, people who are supporting other workers of color in Italy and France and across Europe, coming up from Africa and other places. And again, a little bit of comparing and contrasting how that's worked in Europe, and worked in horrible ways in Europe, and also here in the United States, and kind of can we learn from each other as we fight together. Abraham was alluding to Working Family Solidarity, and we formed about 4.5 years ago, and our mission is to unite low and moderate income families of all backgrounds to work together for equitable development. We decided to call it equitable development specifically because whether it's Chicago, Des Moines, a little outside of 50, 60 miles outside of Chicago, and people had talked about the land, right? The wealthy elite has found legal ways to hurt us, right? So 150 years ago, it was the Trail of Tears to move Seminoles and others from the Southeast all the way to Oklahoma. And that was obviously horrific in an open way. We can't do that anymore. So we do things now like 200,000 African Americans have been pushed out of Chicago in the last 12, 13 years through forces that, if you challenge them, will say these are natural market forces. Gentrification occurs, they can't pay rent anymore, they have to leave. No one's doing anything. Show me the ordinance and the state law that it violates. And so it's kind of like abolitionism, right? We have to go beyond what's written by wealthy people for laws. And I live in the neighborhood Pilsen in Chicago, where at least 10,000 Mexican families have been pushed out in the last 10 years. And what's their crime? Getting up and working as hard as they possibly can every minute from 4 in the morning till like 10 at night, hardly seeing their kids, especially if you're a woman, you get up early to make tortillas. What crime is that? But of course, developers come in, the value of the land, someone determines, it's not us, goes up, and now you fight for all your labor rights and you win all these great labor struggles. Your rent goes up $500 a month. The same companies, same hedge funds that own the companies where we work, and they own where we live. So the company housing that Abraham saw in West Virginia, right, in the coal mines, we still have those. But you got to look a little deeper. It's not quite chattel slavery, but it's wage slavery. And so like the Haymarket martyrs in Chicago said in 1886, the Civil War was settled. The new form of slavery will no longer be chattel slavery. It'll be wage slavery. So everyone thinks they're free, but you basically get to work all day to then get up the next morning and do that again. And whites are just as vulnerable. More whites in this country live in poverty than any other racial or ethnic group. But you'd never believe that, right, from the narratives. But that's our natural ally. I tell our 95% Black and Latino members every day, poor and moderate income whites are our natural allies. They just don't understand it, and that's why racism was developed, to make sure they don't understand it. Because when we stop worrying about the color of our skin, the gig is up, right? It's like, you ever see A Bug's Life? All the ants get together and finally realize there's millions of them and only a few hundred grasshoppers. We're the vast majority on Earth, and that can be kind of our solace and our hope. But racism has been it really didn't exist before capitalism went to a deeper stage. And I'm telling you this, not as a member of any particular party. So no one sent me here to spew any kind of, Marxist talk. I'm not a member of any party at all, of anything, just the executive director of Working Family Solidarity. But if you look before the 1800s, you had basic racial prejudice. Our group against your group, we'll throw some rocks at you, throw some spears, throw some swords, we'll get kind of angry. Nasty things happened, some tension. You did not have whole-scale wiping out of humans based on their race, which physical anthropologists, by the way, say there's one race in the world, one, right? Homo sapiens sapien, that's it. There's not anything else. Some of us have a little more melanin, some of us have a flatter nose, a sharper nose. There are no races. That's a social construct. And once the production started and capitalism found that white folks weren't really going to be the labor they'd hoped, they had to perfect racism, right? So we really encourage people to think about that nexus. And as we come together for economic equality and economic justice, we think that we can learn from each other and overcome our racism that we all have, every one of us on this call, and me too, right? Every one of us on this call, and me too. But it's only through struggling together that we really, really find out how we can support each other and challenge our own inefficiencies and our own problems. So I welcome you to struggle together with us. You have my email, all of you on this call. You can email at any time. I will be reminding you of March 20th. I'd be glad to act to kind of connect people, give each other's emails, and we'll let you know as we hopefully can do more things in person again, how we take this forward. I've done talks in other parts of Illinois, in small towns in other parts of Illinois, invited by Illinois Humanities as part of panels. And we had people get really mad at me, like white rural folks get really pissed at me. But it was interesting that some of them didn't get that pissed. I went to one place and they said, they're going to take our historic town square. They're going to destroy it. And I was like, who's they? When at first it's kind of like, well, they, the Chicago millionaire liberal weirdos that you're probably part of. And when we scratched under the surface, someone stood up in the audience and said, it's not anyone from Chicago. It's some of the local magnates, some of the folks, agribusiness and other people in our counties. And they want to take the town square away from us because they have all these money-making schemes. So again, it's like that poor white person and me, we have everything in common. But we've been trained never to think that we have anything in common. Because if we realize we have the same problem, we're going to fix it, right? So I really urge all of you to think about that. Stay in touch. Email me whenever you want, and I'll do the best I can. I want to thank Reverend Ostendorf, David, a big, huge ton. I was born in Minneapolis way long time ago, and now he's in St. Paul. Abraham Mwaura, we used to work together in Chicago on a lot of things. Thank you for making time. I'm sorry you hardly slept. I hope your 7-month-old lets you sleep at least a few hours. Thomas, thanks for your comments. I want to thank again Somos Sur, the interpreters who were terrific. I want to thank Asia for chat moderating, Matthew's comments, Claudia's comments, Guadalupe's comments. Thank you very much, all of you. Have a great, great evening, and let's stay in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you.